Well, thank you very much for agreeing to show my slides. Since I'm working off an iPad here, I'm not certain exactly how this works. But I want to start with several comments about the previous two talks and how my work relates to this, these views of cybernetics. I think, as most of you know, I'm trained as a biochemist and a geneticist. And for the last few years, I've been working in the natures of logic and mathematics, and developed a system of organic mathematics, which I use in my work to understand human health and the relationships between human health and the exterior world. So for me, if I wanted to comment in this context, I'm taking a totally different, not totally, but a different interpretation of the words of feedback and feed forward than they're commonly used in this group. To me, feedback and feed forward are intrinsic to life. They're part of life. They exist at all levels of life, basically. And this question then that comes up in the natural sciences perspective is, what are the origins of the requisite variety that lead to the control and the process of sustainability of life? So the issue of cybernetics here then is one of causality in the control of the requisite variety and the genesis of the requisite variety. This is a natural science perspective. And from this side of things, I would say that certainly Stuart Umpleby very strongly encouraged me to look at these issues from a cybernetics perspective, as has Harold Morowitz, as well as Professor Dubois in Liège. So there is some relationship between cybernetics as viewed from the mechanical perspective of Werner Wiener and von Foster, and the natural sciences. So my effort then has been to, as part of a program, a broader program of organic mathematics, to fit the origins of cybernetics into the context of the natural sciences. So that is a very different notion of cybernetics, still founded on feedback and feed forward and circularity, but now looking for a way to generate the requisite variety that leads to the possibilities of choices. And these, from the natural sciences, obviously are causal perspectives. So the approach then is of third order biocybernetics, and here interpret biocybernetics as a different form than the other forms, and that's originally why I used the word third order biocybernetics, or third order cybernetics. Actually, in the late 1990s, I published a short paper from the conferences on third order cybernetics. I've changed the name because it certainly doesn't fit in with the current notions of other people's notions of third order cybernetics. Okay, Lowell, could you go with the first slide?
Lowell, could you put that on presentation mode so we can read the text?
Oh, yeah. So the presentation, as I've organized it, it comes as a series of propositions or approaches to propositional logic. And here I have to add a footnote because Maurice reminded me of Schwartz's work in Switzerland. And Schwartz was a friend of mine, and as a physicist, we talked we've talked several times about the relationships between the physics of cybernetics and the chemistry of cybernetics. So these are how I was introduced to Maurice's interest in cybernetics. And I really wanted to say that this Schwartz's contributions to my thinking were significant in the 1990s and that period of framework. So what's going to follow then is a series of slides that are basically all about propositions of what the natural origins of the logic and mathematics of requisite variety under which you have the opportunity to control things. So the first proposition comes from the notion of biocinetic processes of emergence, growth, development, reproduction, and continuation of life, associate and obligate the scientific languages of mathematics, physics, chemistry, and biology. So within the natural sciences, I'm anticipating a coherence among both the mathematics and the logic of these disciplines, such that the processes of emergence, growth, and development, et cetera, occur. The intrinsic to this approach then is the necessary for grammatical foundations for the semiotics of obligations of the scientific notations. So the key word here is obligations of scientific notations. The units of mathematics, which are constructed, are from either as units or integers, but these are separate and distinctive terms, logical terms. Unit being a unity of some form, integers being some sum of units. Units of physical forces, I'm primarily concerned about electrical forces. The other forces from mass, et cetera, are far less interesting and play only a minor role in the overall logic. The units of chemical identity of matter as either atoms or molecules or cells or organisms just associate the materiality of living organisms with their identity. And this identity, obviously, in my interest, include the identity of the patient in the clinic, or the particular form of identity which is of interest to the natural scientist. And finally, the units of reproduction are basically a notion of genes, although that's a limited term in this context. But we're concerned whether the genetic systems are either singular cellular genetic systems or multiple cells. We're going to also expand the grammar of logical constants. Now, the role of logical constants in logic is not widely appreciated in the scientific community. Here it is elevated to a very high level of importance. So these logical constants are conjunction, obligation, implication, negation, and numbers. So these are the, if you would, the foundational terms which are going to be part of the propositions. The units of synduced or obligatory logic of composition. Now, because we're dealing in natural sciences, we're very, very much concerned with how you compose objects from each other. The connectivity of the natural world is readily apparent, I believe, as Larry very directly pointed out, and I wholeheartedly concur with his notion of the relationship of connectivity to nature, and not just to cybernetics. So that these compositions then of obligatory logics involve either atomic sentences or molecular sentences These were well defined by Russell in the 1920s as part of his view of mathematics, or the logic of mathematics, or logicism. So the systematic representation of mathematical objects in the composition of binary notations are mathematical units of partitions, physical units of electrical forces, basically, and chemical units of nuclei and electrons. So this binary notion of compositions or binary notations of units and integers, nuclei and electrons is fundamental to this view of third order cybernetics. These compositions of constructing whole from parts is done or is accomplished or is through the use of the grammar of the logical conjunctions, obligations, implications, negations, and numbers. So all of these notations then result in the compositional logic involved. And finally, the third order biocybernetics is generated from the binary logical causal entailments of the scientific notations, which then are listed as quantities, qualities, terms, time, and theses, theses being propositions in this case. So that if you look at this slide, there is a reflexivity between the title of the slide, that is processes of emergence, etc., biological properties, with Q, Q, T, 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 which is simply an acronym, which I'll use the word QT for, to try and use a holistic terminology that keeps in mind all the pieces of the puzzle at the same time. Lowell, would you like to do the next slide? You still there, Lowell?
Yeah, he's already switched.
It's done.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So the order, I should at this point say that this work that this fragment of my work, which has been going on now for roughly a half a century, is esoteric in its own way, I suppose. It's not something that has come lightly. It's been over a period of like I say, a half a century. And there's several relevant sources here that are not widely quoted or cited or known in the literature of cybernetics. Now, I'm certain several of the people here are well aware of these sources, but I think it's important to highlight them here because they are part of the very essence of third order biocybernetics. And the first of these is Swinehead's work, for a medieval logician, dealing with conditional and obligatory logic. This is non-Boolean logic as essential to it. And for those familiar with the mathematics of cybernetics, Boolean logic is essential. So this is one of the basic dividing points between third order biocybernetics and other views of cybernetics, is that we're starting from a different logical foundation. The second one, A.N. Whitehead's notion of process philosophy, is widely known, and I won't dwell on here at all. And the one person who's well known in the cybernetics community is Soren Breer, as the editor of a leading journal. And his book on cyber semiotics is part of the background logic which goes on here. He views it from the semiotics from a biological perspective as opposed to a physical perspective or a mathematical perspective. I list below that some of my own papers, which are there primarily for publicity's sake for anyone who wants to follow up on this in the literature, and would focus in that most of what I'm going to describe today comes from the notion of organic mathematics as being a binary notation for logical mathematics. Next slide, Lo. So C.S. Peirce is known to many of you. He proposed, this is come from the 1880s, I suppose, a notion of trichotomy. And his notion of trichotomy was that of a cyclic logic of semantics and syntactical diagrams. A graph theoretic approach, if you would, that he eventually developed. I focus on this particular argument because that he presents, because it is foundational to the logic of the approach of the logic of bio-cybernetics. And I will go through this. Now, this is a historical argument that he's putting together here with regard to cyclic logic that included both semantics and syntactical diagrams. The focus first on the middle column of this presentation, of this trichotomy, as he called it, the sin sign, the index, and the desi sign are all related. The sin sign for him was based on a single unique object, so that in the chemical sense, he had to start with a pure unique substance, or in the cybernetic sense, in a single concept or idea, and then expand that. The qualisign would be measurements and other observations with regard to the nature of the sin sign, and the legi sign in Peirce's terminology would be the official name or the official identity of the sin sign. So the top row in this diagram simply presents the scientific terminology of representation of a species. The middle row is an abstract level of how you represent the signs above. This is the mental processes that generate icons, indices, and symbols. Indices here is taken in the sense of mathematical enumeration or mathematical counting of parts of the whole. The other symbol systems could be added to that. For example, we could, under the symbol system, consider all the units of the natural sciences invoke in terms of QT. And finally, the logical arguments in the bottom row of the table, the Riemann, Desi sign, and argument can be viewed as molecular sentences, atomic sentences, molecular sentences, and then the composition of these molecular and atomic sentences into an argument. So this is a rough and certainly I've added a lot of content to C.S. Peirce's arguments, but nevertheless, this skeleton of arrangement of ideas, of views of how a word is used in terms of a logical argument is faithful to C.S. Peirce's notions, I believe. Others might want to argue that point. Next slide, Lowell. So the next proposition I missed, okay. The proposition, Lowell, could you flip the next slide up? No, the next one. Okay, apparently I've messed up the slides a little bit. So the scientific background for legisigns is for non-Boolean notations of perplex numbers, electricity, chemical relatives, and the genetic code. The propositions are basically the identities of entities are enumerated from the scientific reference notations and the scientific facts. The categories of the diagrams of representation of identities of electrical parts of wholes gives reference to the scope and scale of the atomic numbers. So this last proposition here, categories of diagrams of representations of identities of electrical parts of wholes are referenced in the atomic numbers, and this becomes then the base of the construction of the compositions. This is two parts of this form of proposition that are separated in terms of the representation of the natural sciences and how you choose symbols to represent the natural sciences. The diagrammatic part of the representation of natural objects is put into the mathematics of graph theory based on the number system. And this gives complete graphs, or you can just represent all the integers of the graphs, or you can just represent the units of the graphs, or you can make bipartite graphs of units and integers. And you can label these graphs with the names of the objects. And then, of course, if one wants to deal with the living systems, you need to deal with the handedness of molecules, as well as the notion of composition of any of these graphs or all of these graphs into complete objects. And then one has the notion of the indices of the integers of the associated units, the matching pairs of units, the matching pairs of integers and heterotetratic cycles, which is a representation of a chemical bond, and so forth. And here, all the ignorance is placed into the and so forth phrase until all the iterations, elation is a term related to relation, are accounted for. So the completeness of the representation comes from joining together by matching the individual terms of the logic. This matching is easily thought of and is best thought of in terms of attractors and repellers of dynamics. Next slide, Lowell.
Got it. It's out.
Oh, yeah, it's unfortunate. I omitted the a critical slide in what I sent Lowell. So this should be the last slide. Is that correct? No, one more slide.
Next, this is next.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go to the last slide. Okay. Let's go to this. Let's go to the last slide, Lowell, and then we'll return to this one. So to place this set of propositions, which are rather phrased in a technical language of the natural sciences, and this language is foreign to many of you, I would try and tie things together in a certain sense with a modified Rosen diagram. For those who are familiar with Rosen's work, and we did have one discussion on it somewhat, he attempted to use, or sought to use, the language of category theory to construct his view of life itself. This is a modified Rosen diagram. In Rosen's diagram, he had two sides of it. One was simple labeled causality, which would be on the left here. And on the other side, he had inferences, which would be on the right side here. So that in this part, I'm faithful to his representation. But what failed from Rosen's diagram was his any idea of what sort of dictionary he was going to use. So the cyclic part of Rosen's diagram was based on the lower arrow being a dictionary, which he did not define. I have given you the definitions of the scientific notations which constitute the dictionaries for third order bio-cybernetics. It is these terms of the scientific notations that give rise to the antecedents of the logical inferences. So since this is a very, very critical notion to the overall scheme of things, let me repeat that sentence. So the lower arrow representing the relationship between causal claims and logical inferences is a set of antecedent definitions which are taken from scientific notations and arranged on the notion of the scale and scope of the objects. So that natural objects comes in different scales and scopes. These different scales and scopes of natural objects are reflected in different notations, as I pointed out in the early slide, and that some of these notations require that the terms are obligatory terms that must appear in both the antecedent proposition and the conclusion or the consequence proposition. So that this an obligation of inheritance or entailment of terms is what the lower arrow represents. The logical methods that are used, going to the right-hand diagram, of the scientific notations requires electrical quanta. Particularly, this would then be expressions of quantum electrodynamics, if you wanted to go into the physical aspects of it, or it would be in the notion of atoms and molecules, or in the notion of attractors and repellers, if you wanted to take a different view of dynamics. Atomic numbers and would then, of course, lead to both atomic propositions and molecular propositions, and the construction of biological propositions from the biological scope of the terms. So following those logical inferences, one would then come to the consequences or conclusions of the situation. This notion of consequence then would be logically follow from the antecedent terms which you used. A simple example here would be if the terms on the antecedent terms were hydrogen and oxygen and water, then the logical inferences that you would make from a quantum electrodynamic perspective would be the conjunction of oxygen and hydrogen to form water. Analogously, if one was talking about the anatomy, then if the antecedent terms were genetic terms for a particular protein, then the logical inferences would be the catalysis of a particular metabolite from that particular protein, which in turn would lead to the consequences of one step in the processes of metabolism. So each of these, I would say, the interrelationship here between the scope of the term and the quantity of the term are intimately related. This is not a typical view of, well, let's say that this association of scope and scale with the terms or with the notations of the science are absolutely essential to drawing a logical conclusion from such a diagram. So this is why I refer to it as an obligatory diagram. And obviously, from a broader perspective, the eco-parent, that is the surroundings of the organism, contribute to the antecedent terms, as well as the, and are necessary antecedent terms for the description of life itself. And this focuses then on the notion of an eco-parent of the system and an endo-parent of the system that you're investigating. And so from there, let's move to the last slide. To the previous slide, Lowell. Okay. So here's two basic propositions that deal with third order biocybernetics. These then is that the permutation groups, that is, permutation groups are can be of any scale, but they will have some particular identity. So permutation groups of numbers entail the patterns and operations, which refer to the syntropy of life, from the generative attractors and repellers created from the electrical attributes of the self-composed structures of the organism. This is a basic proposition. There's two sub-propositions that come from it. Emergence of spontaneous continuity of life is stipulated by the interior genetic permutation groups as a syntropic sequence of matchings of attractors and repellers that reproduce all of the parts of the whole organism. And then as far as the spontaneity of life is concerned, the spontaneous ligations of the interior dynamics of life are generated by the patterns of attractors and repellers emerging from the logic of permutation groups of quanta of electricity. The symbolic endoparents, that is the genetic code, organizes the permutation groups, and the eco-parent supplies the matter and energy to perform the anatomical work or the syntropy of the organization. These are two, if you would, sub-propositions that come out of the basic proposition of the organization of organic mathematics into, if you would, practical concerns. I think I will stop there. I would say that for those, I made an earlier presentation on October 20th, 2002, excuse me, 2021. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my screen went blank. Okay, so that I included those slides after the set of slides which Jason distributed. And from there, I will just make one final note. I have not dealt in this particular time because I've already presented a great body of information, but I have not dealt in any depth with either quantum mechanics or thermodynamics. Both of these are comfortable, shall we say, in this logical environment. And particularly, the comfort is created with thermodynamics by recognizing that entropy is in the natural sciences is the notion of heat, and that syntropy, the analogous term originally coined by an Italian mathematician, syntropy is that of work, and it is that notion of work as the conjunction of objects, the composition or conjunction of objects that perform the work of life. And so this bridges the really, really confusing issue that has come up from many, many sources with regard to the dominant role of entropy in life. The argument is that work is the dominant natural science concept that is essential to emergence and behavior of life itself. So I'll stop there, and I thank you very much for your attention.